You have argued that our extractive economies and forms of life are not just matters of how we organise our economic or technological or energy systems, but say something much larger about how humans understand themselves. Can you explain what you mean?
Firstly, just hello, everybody. Nice to be here with you. And I am sorry and also not sorry that I brought you back to the trauma, because there's something about being face to face with the reality of something like a catastrophic fire that is very truing. You know, I think for many of us, as long as climate change is abstract, it's something that we read about, it's something that's happening in the Amazon or in California even, or in, you know, the Arctic, or we think it's going to happen at some other time, it remains with the quality of the fantastical. And it's really when it hits our bodies, we like to think of ourselves as minds on bodies, but we are bodies and we feel with our bodies. So I think it's important to be reminded, but also want to acknowledge all the suffering of the Ash Wednesday and the Black Saturday fires. And really important to remember, these fires were September, October, November, December, January. 5 months. That's almost half a year. So the idea that fires burn in the intensity of summer is one of the casualties of the climate catastrophe. They now spread not only geographically, but also temporally. So to your question, so, you know, this is a session on moving from extraction as a form of energy generation to renewables. And, you know, I mean, Ketan will talk much more about the technology side of it, and that's critically important. You know, the invention, the move to renewables, the move of the economy to renewables. But it's not just about what energy systems we use. It's also about how do we relate to the more than human world. And the fact that certainly for the last 150 years, but more intensely for the last 50 years of the Great Acceleration, we have had this hyper-extractive relationship with all other beings, with the earth, where we take from it as if it is just given to us, literally given to us by God, even if we don't have religious worldviews. The inheritance of the West is this understanding that it is our bounty, that we have dominion over it. And the more abstract it becomes as more and more of us live highly urbanized lives, the less understanding we have of the violence that we're doing to the rest of the world. And it nowhere more evident than in the industrial warehousing of animals. You know, very few people realize in the United States, 97% of animals who form the basis of people's diets are in concentrated animal feedlots. They never go outside. They never get to experience anything like a life. And that understanding of ourselves as having dominion, having the right to extract from other for ourselves, seems to me to be the ideological infrastructure that supports an extractive industry. So yes, we need to move to renewables, and yes, we need the scientists and the engineers and the tech experts and the economists to be shifting our energy systems and our economics, but we also need to shift how we understand ourselves in relation to the more than human world.
There's this general idea that somehow mining fossil fuels doesn't really count towards the moral burden for climate in Australia. And that's something that I've really been obsessed with challenging, because of course, when it comes to accounting, when it comes to the spreadsheets that everybody keeps around the world about who's doing what emissions, the current way we do it is that we mark down whatever was burnt within the borders of our country. So if Australia digs up a lump of coal and sells it to Japan, then Japan counts that lump, the emissions from that lump of coal, under their ledger. But Australia played a role in the moral burden of that emissions happening. And so it goes down not just to Australia, but to the state level decisions that enable the mining of fossil fuels, and of course the corporate decisions that enable the mining of fossil fuels as well, which is another thing that we sort of, I feel that isn't really interrogated quite well enough. So what we're seeing is that the sale of coal in Australia has leveled off, but of course it shouldn't level off, right? Like, this is something that needs to be decreasing over time for the threat of climate change to be reduced. And gas in particular is expanding quite rapidly. And then of course the problem on top of all of this is that when you dig up gas in particular, it's a particularly emissions intensive thing to do. So there are leaks from methane. Methane is a particularly potent greenhouse gas, and that is causing damage. So Australia's domestic emissions are also rising, and the emissions from digging up fossil fuels is cancelling out the gains from installing new renewable energy in the grid. And as a consequence, Australia's emissions have essentially flatlined. Because the growth of renewables are probably about to slow down in Australia, that means Australia's emissions will start increasing. So after COVID, what we're going to see is an increase anyway, because, you know, nothing fundamental has changed. All COVID did was reduce the demand for the activities that require fossil fuels. And so as those activities, the demand for those activities increases, then emissions will go up, and the worst case scenario, emissions will keep going up after that, because Australia is just extracting so much coal and gas and selling it overseas. That's going to cause a major problem.
While you're speaking, what can be done not just by government and business, but also the personal level in response to climate change?
Well, I'm going to start by quoting the great Bill McKibben, who was talking about climate change before any of us were talking about climate change, in his book, The End of Nature. And in a column, he writes a wonderful column in the New Yorker, for those of you who are looking for good informative material to read. And he said, when people ask me what can individuals do, I say, become a little less individual. And I think that's a really important answer in many ways, that yes, our individual behavior, our individual energy use, the way that we eat are important, but I think they're mainly important because they remind us of possibility, and they provide a type of performative role for others. But it's the systems that Ketan was talking about. It's the systems of extraction. It's the systems of capital accumulation. It's the systems of industrial animal farming that are problematic. And the only way that we change those is through collective action. And so what we can do is we can join with each other. And whatever it is that you love doing, you know, whatever it is that you do, if you're a teacher, if you're a doctor, if you work in an organization, you can do that in relation to climate change. You know, you can shift your organization's investments. I mean, firstly, take your money out of any financial institution that's investing in fossil fuels. Not only your own investments, but if the institution is investing in fossil fuels, take your money out of that institution. So number one, let your political representatives know that unless they have an emissions plan, not only zero emissions by 2050, but a plan with a target by 2030, they're not getting your vote. So those are institutional, and talk about it. Don't avoid talking about it. It is difficult to talk about it, but starting gently, you know, baby wombat, conversations that are tolerable so that we begin to move it from over here to here. I think those are all things that we can all do immediately.
I have to explain my optimism, because it comes with a whole bunch of caveats. It stems essentially from watching all of the missed opportunities fly by every day and knowing how easy who it would be to actually seize them. And so I'll give you an example. You know, the decision to keep a coal-fired power station running for another 5 years or to close it today, that's a decision that a human being will make. And too often they make the wrong decision. And that's an avoidable error, right? This is something that is really happening constantly. And the sum impact of these bad decisions by people is that currently we're emitting far too much. And even under our current pledges and plans around the world is due for around 3 degrees of warming, potentially even more. That's not good at all. And that's assuming that even all those pledges and targets are met. So the curve needs to be pushed much further downwards. The reason that I'm weirdly optimistic about that is that, first of all, action seems to build on itself. We seem to have tipping points, not just in the Earth's climate system itself, but in the systems of human behavior. So change seems to become unstoppable when it comes to things like technologies or behavior or corporations or even governments. You can have this snowballing effect. And so when that happens, our task becomes to make it go faster, because we want to reduce emissions as much as possible. And then secondly, when we realize exactly how much power we have, and for a long time we've kind of been bullied into thinking that we're powerless, then it's a really shocking thing. And so when when Danny was talking about taking your money out of financial institutions that are investing in fossil fuels, Bill McKibben has been doing a lot of that, over the past for quite a long time, and the impacts are really tangible. This is having when you dig into the numbers, you can see the numbers changing, and that's incredible. And when people realize that, they're like, "Oh, wow, okay, the things I do actually have an impact in the world. I thought I was kind of just this small individual, and the most that I could do was, walk into the shops instead of driving to the shops." And so there's this dawning realization that what we describe as activism is actually just the power of community and the power of people working in unison.